Welcome to the Wildlife Wire. I'm Mark Searles,
And I'm Samantha Miller.
and this is your source for wildlife news and the people that make it. All right, well, Sam, we are really punching above our weight today. Our
Yes, we
guest,
are. We
yeah,
are.
our guest is an acclaimed documentary film director, producer, writer, cinematographer, and composer. His work has sparked global conversations about the environment, health, and animal rights. His films have been executive produced by Leonardo DiCaprio and Joaquin Phoenix. He has challenged industries and inspired countless people to reconsider their impact on the planet and their own well being. With a passion for storytelling and social justice, he brings a unique perspective on the power of media to drive change. Though his newest project leaves the cinematic world, opting for a real world immersive experience instead. His most famous works include documentaries What the Health and Cowspiracy. So, welcome, Keegan Kuhn.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, that was fun. That was my favorite intro I've done so far.
Absolutely. Yeah, Keegan, the work you do is so important, and your storytelling is just incredibly compelling. Maybe you could tell our listeners a bit how you choose the subject matter you're focusing on, and what are some of the things that stood out to you about why you chose the documentaries you've done.
Well, thanks so much. Firstly, I'm deeply appreciated to you both for the work that you all are doing. It's vital that we tell the stories, particularly of carnivores in North America, but all wild, free living animals. How I choose my films is really comes down to passion. I have to feel passionate about whatever story I'm telling, and it also tends to be the untold stories or the stories that aren't getting enough attention, which I think is very much the kind of mission of this podcast as well, is telling stories that aren't getting enough attention. Sometimes people come to me with stories and they say, "Hey, I really wish you could do a film on this." Other times it's just something where I hear a story, I hear about a subject, and I think that's something I have to do. So, um, one of my most recent projects, I did a short film called Serengeti of America about the Southern Plains Land Trust in southeastern Colorado. And it was because I met one of their board members and one of the folks who worked for the organization. And it sounded like an amazing project, what they were doing, an inspiring story that wasn't getting enough attention. So I thought, cool, let's do that. And that's often how most of my films come about, is just following passion, following curiosity for myself.
Yeah, and that passion certainly comes across in the films. And speaking of Southern Plains Land Trust, tomorrow I'll see Jay Touchton at a Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission meeting, and I always tell him I'm going to get out there and have yet to do so. So I feel shame on that, but I know it's a beautiful place. Was Dan Flores involved in that film?
Yeah, and so funny. No, Dan wasn't involved in it, and hence why the name is not American Serengeti,
Gotcha.
Dan's book. It's Serengeti of America. But yeah, the film follows Jay Touchton and Nicole Rose Marino on about their work. And so it's just a short little film. It's available on waterbear.com, which is kind of Netflix for nature, which is a pretty cool platform. And yeah, I just wanted to highlight their work because it is beautiful and it's important and it's inspiring and reminds people that there's still a lot worth fighting for.
And what species are you covering in that film that our listeners might be interested in? Who's living on the American Serengeti?
Yeah, so the Southern Plains Land Trust has reintroduced bison. So there are bison, large prairie dog populations, colonies that they're really trying to establish. They brought back black-footed ferrets into the area, but it's really just taking down fences and allowing the wild ones to come back and giving them a space where they don't have to be fearful of hunting. They don't have to deal with competition with grazing. They don't have to deal with fence lines, and it's just a wild place for them to be. And so it's a really important rewilding project because, as we know, policy can change, regimes change, and we see the threats that happen to wild ones and public lands and wild lands. And when you have a private conservation organizations like Southern Plains Land Trust, they're taking that element out of the equation because they control the land, and so they can decide and make sure that doesn't matter what happens in Washington, that land will stay forever wild.
Yeah, for sure. And we will certainly dive into public lands and grazing and all that shortly. I do want to stick on the topic of documentary films in general right now. And I know we've talked about the challenges that documentary films face these days and regarding their distribution on streaming platforms. And so, do you feel that what these streaming companies want to show aligns with what the public wants to see?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of the big platforms like Netflix and Hulu and HBO, or formerly HBO, used to have a really wide selection of films, and particularly documentary films. And that's how my film Cowspiracy got up on there, and What the Health and a number of other films that I've worked on or produced have gotten on Netflix because they were interested in a wide breadth of subject matter. Sadly, we've seen a shift away from that, and it's all algorithm driven, and we're seeing big big outlets, ones that you wouldn't expect, like National Geographic, really just interested in true crime and celebrity driven content. And I've had meetings with a lot of these companies and pitch them on a new film, and they say, yeah, it's great, but no, this is all we're interested in. And so it's like, if you can get a celebrity beat in the face of it, and you want to talk about wolves, cool, we'll have Will Smith go on a journey learning about wolves, then we're interested. Or if it's about someone being murdered, we're interested. But it has to be a human being. They're not interested in non-humans being killed. Um, so sadly, it's been a very hard time the last 5 years. Basically, since COVID, the whole documentary space has been in kind of upended because of the way things are going. But thankfully, there are platforms like Waterbear. YouTube has really opened up a lot for a lot of people for distribution. But finding good films is hard. And again, I don't know if it's people are being fed what they want, what they're asking for, or they're being force fed things because this is what the algorithm tells the executives at these networks what they should be buying and releasing.
Right. It seems like there's a lot of parallels there between traditional media and what's happening on these streaming platforms, where we've seen really storied news outlets shift from great in-depth journalism to clickbait and less in-depth stories. And folks aren't really willing to go up against funders or up against ad buyers. And as they follow these algorithms, I think it's dangerous. We start losing intelligence in America, which is really sad. And we hope to get at some of that through our podcast, and we're glad that you're doing that. And Water Bear sounds excellent. I'm excited that you shared that with our listeners. I'm sure they'll be very interested in that. To get to informing the public, and in two of your bigger documentaries that are featured on Netflix, what does Cowspiracy tell us about the country we live in, the environment we're in, and wild animals and agriculture?
Yeah, so Cowspiracy follows my co-director, Kip Anderson, on a journey trying to figure out what is the most destructive industry facing the planet today. And he finds out that it's animal agriculture. Animal agriculture influences climate change, deforestation, species extinction, topsoil erosion, water pollution, water consumption, ocean dead zones. I mean, literally anything you could care about in the environmental world, animal agriculture is at this forefront. And why many of the large environmental organizations are failing to address this or failing to properly address it. Thankfully, CBD is one of the few organizations that actually does address it. But the film looks at that and then looks at the global impact of animal consuming diet and this industry in particular. And what kind of separates Cowspiracy from other environmental films or other films that deal with animal agriculture is that we didn't put a heavy focus on factory farming, because we felt like there was already films like Food Inc. That showed factory farming. And I feel like a lot of people, particularly in North America, understand that factory farming is horrific for the animals. And so we thought, well, we don't really need to dwell on that. Let's look at free range. Let's look at cage free. Let's look at the organic operations. And through the investigation, we find that those operations are actually primary driver for species killing. For example, cattle ranchers really don't like predators, so they want them killed, and they use their lobbying power to use wildlife services to exterminate these animals. Where the factory farm industry is not as interested. They don't care because they keep their animals in confinement. The land use issue. And so, the organic farms and free range farms use, sometimes 2, 3, 4 times more land than factory farmers do, because they're keeping their animals in confinement. They're feeding them grains that they're growing. You can produce a lot more food on plant-based food on the same area of land that you could for grazing. And there's a lifespan. And so the film looks at that. It's a very controversial film. Got a lot of pushback from a lot of different people. It's all peer-reviewed science, though. Everything on the film is backed up by research available on Cowspiracy's website. So you go to cowspiracy.com/facts, and you can see all the research time-coded for the film. But it raises the question, why, if this is the biggest issue, why aren't we hearing about it? And as you kind of pointed out, it's the same old stories. It's profits. It's people being concerned about pushback. It's about money makers making the decisions for policies, and it's the reason why the federal government still subsidizes this industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And can we dive in a little deeper, I think, on public lands grazing? That's something that a lot of people don't know, that the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management actively incentivize grazing on public lands and then will kill carnivores for producers that already get the subsidized grazing on public lands, in addition to the impacts of the cows themselves. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that a little bit more and what's happening on the ground in public lands that a lot of us cherish across the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think when talking about public lands, but first and foremost, we have to acknowledge the fact that these are stolen indigenous lands, right? These are lands that were taken from indigenous people and displaced indigenous people. Federal government, you know, displaces indigenous people. The European Americans come in and they start running sheep and cows, and they decimate the land. They overgraze it just horrifically. One, because the ecosystems weren't designed for Eurasian livestock. And so then the government responds and develops the Bureau of Land Management to try and halt the grazing. And, originally I think it was called the Bureau of Grazing, Cattle and Grazing, or Livestock and Grazing, something along those lines, because they realized that this industry was just going to decimate the American West in particular. But that still continues today. We still see the impact of this industry having incredible sway over the government on their policies, on lands being grazed, and we continue to see them degraded. And part of that is because the Bureau of Land Management has this multi-pronged mission. They have to provide for all user groups. So that means the conservationists should get equal say as the miners, as the cattle ranchers, as the ATVers, as the hunters. But the reality is that if you have one industry that disproportionately affects every other user group and the health of the entire ecosystem, well, then that needs to be addressed. But sadly, we still see that the livestock industry gets a larger share of the cut from our public lands. But things are changing, things are moving. We are seeing pushback. But the reality is that this is only a tiny, tiny percentage of animals raised for slaughter in the United States is on public lands. It's about 2.5%. It varies from year to year. But the reason why they still have such power is because the entire livestock industry gets behind it. They need the cowboy image. They need this ranchericized image of cowboys on the American West to be able to sell their factory farm product. So that's one of the reasons why my films and me as an activist have advocated very strongly for a 100% economic boycott of this industry. It's not just cattle ranching on public lands. It's not just free range. It's not just factory farming. It's the entire industry, because it's the only way we're going to see change is when they no longer have the economic pull over our government.
Yeah, I think about the Taylor Grazing Act or the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act that really gave away public lands to producers and timber and all of the big industries. It's pretty awful. I I always find it fascinating that cows too will kill 22 people a year. Mark knows this fact. I've said it a couple times. Cows will actually trample 22 people per year, and wolves have killed 2 people in the history of North America. And yet we allow cows on public lands and wolves are the problem. And I think that kind of hypocrisy is incredible, but yet it allows the continued use of lands by special interests. So how else are you seeing these ranchers or livestock producers subsidized?
Yeah, so the subsidies to the livestock industry are massive. It's in the form of subsidizing grains. About half of all food grown in the U.S. goes to non-human animals, and that's being subsidized heavily by the federal government. The Farm Bill comes through and just says, cool, we'll just cut hundreds of millions of dollars to farmers to grow food to feed to livestock, which artificially keeps the price of meat cheap. When you take away the federal subsidies, $2 Big Mac is going to cost you about $22. So this being subsidized massively. The environmental impact of this industry is also subsidized, or it's offset. If ranchers pollute entire water systems, they're not responsible for cleaning up the water. They're not held economically responsible for the impacts to all other industries and all other users downstream. The loss of topsoil, on and on, the environmental degradation that this industry causes, they don't carry the burden of the economic impact that everyone else is forced to deal with. So that's one of the major impacts economically. But I think it really comes down to the policy. And then, just as you pointed out about the cows killing people versus wolves, it's the narrative, right? That this industry still controls the narrative. And that's why independent media, like what you all are doing and what I've tried to do with my films, is so important, because we're not hearing this on mainstream media. We're not hearing this in Congress. We are hearing the same old, which is, especially when it comes to the American West, the good old cowboy and this romanticized image, and that this is important. And I make a shirt that says, wolves belong, cows don't. And just to reframe it, to always remember that, like, this industry does not belong on public lands. It doesn't belong in America at all, truthfully, because these animals are Eurasian livestock. They are an invasive species, in my opinion, and they have no ecological place. And so I think it's always important that we reframe the conversation around what is right, what is true, and what actually belongs. And the wild ones belong here. Invasive European livestock don't.
Yeah, I agree. And you brought up the amount of land that is used to grow feed for these cows. So if everyone in the US tomorrow went to a plant-based diet, it wouldn't be a one-to-one change as far as, well, we'll need all of that protein that we were getting from cows, we'll now need it from soybeans. So then, and all of the things, right? So now we'll need to have more plant protein. Like, there would still probably be a reduction in actual agriculture to produce protein, right?
Yeah. So, if everybody boycotted this industry and decided to eat plants instead of animal-based products, we'd be able to retire more than half of all agricultural land in the U.S. So 50% of all the land just immediately could go back to wild spaces. And that's because this is just incredibly inefficient use of land. You can produce about 16 times more protein on any given area of land with plants than you can with animals, because those animals have to eat plants to then, they're going to metabolize most of it. They're just going to burn it up in their daily lives before they're going to turn it into muscle or flesh or fat. So just that alone, people say, well, especially I live in Arizona, so it's like we live in arid environments. People say, well, this is only good for raising livestock. It's like, well, actually, it's not good for raising livestock at all. It's not ideal in any way. It's not ideal for cultivated agriculture either. But if you're going to have to feed people, which we do have to feed people, there's 8 billion plus people on the planet. What's the most efficient way to do it? And even in an arid environment, it would be with intensive agriculture. My background before being a filmmaker was an organic farm developer. So I spent about a decade traveling the world, developing and implementing small-scale organic agriculture using a biointensive method, which is using as little resources as possible to produce as much food as possible. And the reason for that is because we have a right to be here as a species, but we don't have a right to be everywhere. And I think this kind of human-centric idea of that, well, we have a right to this, we have the right to be everywhere. And it's like, well, no, the wolves have a right to be here. It's like the elk have a right to be here. The bison have a right to be here. All the wild ones have a right to be here. And we need to share that space. So, yeah, that's why I've advocated for a plant-based diet and a move away from an animal-based industry, is because it allows more space. And so if we saw this on a global scale, we potentially would be able to right now, 45% of the world's ice-free land is used for animal agriculture. Like almost half of the entire planet is used for animal agriculture. And again, when you put a cow down, that means you just removed 4 elk or more. And it's like you just removed 8 pronghorn or more. And so it's always just keeping that into perspective, that just the land alone is the bigger issue. And then when people say, well, okay, well, we're just going to do grass-fed, or we're going to do regenerative agriculture, we're going to do holistic management, grazing, it's the same issue, and it takes more land. And so in Cowspiracy, we show that if everyone in the United States decided to replace all their animal-based protein with grass-fed beef, it would require all of the United States land, every square inch. It would require most of Canada, all of Central America, and about half of South America just to meet the U.S.'s current demand for meat. So it's like the grass-fed, organic, holistic, all whatever buzzwords they want to add is not the solution either. But really, the solution is we have to stop supporting this industry.
Yeah, and it I get where people are coming from when they say, you know, we were hunter gatherers. Like meat is part of our history. It's part of what grew our brains. Like, and now you're telling me I can't eat meat anymore. And I think a lot of that has happened just within the past 100 years of why we can't do this is because of not just meat, but how much meat we have gone to where you can head up from your house in any direction and find a fast food burger,
Yeah.
right? And so there's while there's policy issues, I think there's a big cultural problem as well. And we are living in while it's a time of biodiversity crisis, we are living in this wealth of of meat that we hadn't ever experienced before, right?
Yeah.
And so I understand that reluctance. So how do we get somewhat the individual to say, actually, I need to change my ways to not support this industry?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, probably a lot of your listeners are familiar with the shifting baseline syndrome, right? We just accept what today is as has how it's always been when it hasn't been. So the current meat consumption in the United States is drastically higher than it's ever been. And for most of human history, there's no really culture in the world that has eaten as much meat, even indigenous cultures, short of the far north, indigenous cultures that have had probably historically a very heavy meat diet. But it wasn't really until the advent of chemical agriculture that meat consumption was a common thing. Most people around the world, about 10% of their diet comes from animals. 10% of their calories comes from animal base. And when we see over 10% is when we start to see a lot of the deleterious health effects, right? High rates of diabetes, heart disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer rates go up through the roof once you get above that 10% of animal consumption for the diet. But it really wasn't, meat consumption was such a small thing prior to World War II, really. And, a lot of people, it's like, yeah, they ate chicken once a week. And otherwise, they ate a plant-based diet. And I've traveled around the world meeting people from all different economic standings and all different cultures. And you look at traditional cultures, it's like the traditional human diet is a plant-based diet. Our teeth are designed for it. Our digestion is designed for it. Yes, we have eaten meat through our history as a species, and it probably played a role. But the marketing of this industry has been incredibly impactful, where we also attribute meat with manliness, right? Like eating meat is tough, it's macho, it's manly, and so there's that aspect of it too. There's obviously, the history of hunting as well, but hunting is so inefficient when you look at it again from a traditional and like global human perspective. Most human hunts, and most hunts, as you all know as carnivore experts too, are not successful. And it really wasn't until the advent of cooking that we became actually like a successful hunting species. And you look at our closest living relatives like chimpanzees and to a lesser extent bonobos, they only hunt when their bellies are full, right? So they only hunt as like a recreational thing. They don't hunt really for calories. And human beings, we also kind of play that role as well, is that you can't go out and afford the energy to go and hunt unless you have the guarantee that there's food back at home. And the only way there's food back at home is because somebody's making food, someone's grinding corn, someone's, boiling beans to have food, because meat also doesn't last very long. So meat really is, if it belongs at any point, it's a very, very small percent, under 10%. And again, you just look at, globally, and that's pulling back and realizing that human beings we're not carnivorous apes. We never have been. It's only because of recently. And then you just talk about this wealth of meat. We now suffer from the disease of kings, right? So gout was literally called the disease of kings because only royalty had it, because they were the only people who could afford to eat meat and eat these high fat diets. And so they developed gout. And now we have these diseases that are just unbelievably rampant that cost, millions of lives every single year because we've been force fed food that we are not designed to eat in any regard.
And so I imagine this lobbying industry of livestock, is that how we got meat as such a pillar in our food pyramid that we all see as elementary school kids?
Yeah, I mean, so the U.S. Department of Agriculture is the one who oversees the dietary guidelines for Americans. That seems like a pretty
Huh.
big conflict of interest, right?
We
That
we live in conflicts of interest all
yeah,
the
And
time,
let's
yes.
not forget dairy on that
that's
lobbying
it.
as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's an interesting one too because there's every 5 years the Department of Health and Human Services does a new guideline for the dietary guidelines for Americans, and that just decides federal policies around food, and so that affects school lunch programs, prisons, military, and I guess just the general guidelines of what Americans should be eating. And the lobbying behind that is massive. It's a meat and dairy industry. It's a fast food industry. They put a ton of time into making sure that sugar remains part of the dietary guidelines. And it's like, well, added sugar to our diet is not a healthy or an essential part of our diet. Like fruits absolutely get a ton of sugar from fruits. Our brain runs on sugar. Um, and the alcohol industry also influences, candy companies also influence, but the grain producers also as well. The reason why the food pyramid and they've shifted away from food pyramid to it's called My Plate now, and it's mostly carbohydrates, which is what our brains really run on. Big heavy emphasis on fruits and vegetables, and then a small part for fat because fat is essential. And where you get your fat, it can be debated, but yeah, we do need fat in our diet in some regard. Um, but yeah, they push really, really hard to make sure that the industry is represented. So like the traditional food pyramid, yeah, it's this huge thing on cereals and grains. It's like, well, should we be really eating that many cereals and grains? Like, should we be eating probably more rice and beans? Like, probably. But the grain producers also lobby. So it's not like the plant-based producers are also innocent in their lobbying power and shifting what we're being taught.
So it sounds like our food policies and directives that we learn about as part of our education, as part of our facts we learn growing up, that those are all decided really by a handful of lobbyists with deep pockets.
That pretty much sums it up. Yeah.
Perfect. That's good to know. I'll talk to my child about that as he goes through school. But yeah, I think that's pretty concerning. So, what are some of the impacts? You mentioned heart disease and other effects. What else is meat doing to us? How is it slowing us down? Is it making us worse off? How is it impacting us?
Yeah. There was a study that just came out last week, or was just published last week about meat versus plant-based protein and muscle growth, and that muscle and developing muscle, particularly for like performance athletes, it was just as good from plant-based sources, if not slightly better than animal-based. So there's really nothing from animal-based foods that is essential to us that we can't find in plants. There's this long, belief, and it's a misnomer really, that we have to combine certain plant-based food to meet perfect proteins, and that's been disproven. Really, everything we need comes from plants. And so we see some of the world's best performing athletes are plant-based. Some of the world record holding runners, swimmers, weightlifters across the board. So there is this seems to be this performance benefit from eating a non-inflammatory diet, which is, meat and dairy particularly inflame our systems. But yeah, the chronic rates of disease are the big concern for me. So cancer rates go up dramatically the more meat you eat. And we see this in non-human animals as well. The cancer rates among carnivores is higher than in herbivores. And even though they're eating the diet they're supposed to eat. And part of that is because bioaccumulation of toxins. So we have things like dioxins, some of the most toxic substances known to science that come primarily out of burning trash, end up in our environments, and those bioaccumulate in the body. And so those are directly linked to cancer. We see things like strontium-90, radioactive materials that our body sees as calcium, so we store it in our bones. And so dioxins, going back to that one, is they sampled the breast milk from Inuit mothers in Greenland, and the dioxin levels in their breast milk was so high that it would be illegal to sell, right? Because it breaks all of the toxin rules. But they're forced to give this feed their children with this. And it's because these accumulate so intensely in our bodies. And this is part of also the thing where when people talk about like free range or grass-fed meat as being healthier, it's like, well, that ignores the fact that the environmental accumulation still is there, and in fact is actually higher because those animals live longer and eat more. Um, we did a whole film called What the Health that looks at the impacts of an animal-based diet versus a plant-based diet. And I did another film called They're Trying to Kill Us, which looks at the disproportionate rates of chronic disease for Americans of color in particular, and the history of using food as a weapon to subjugate non-white Europeans, or non-white European Americans. And we go into depth on the science behind it. And again, it was really just looking at what has the lowest impact on our bodies, but thinking it holistically, what has the lowest impact on this global body, which is the planet that we live on.
Yeah, for sure. And I have some non-peer reviewed anecdotal evidence of what a predominantly plant-based diet can do. So, I lived in Zambia for 3 years. I lived in a village for 2 of those years, and we ate primarily in shima, which is like a corn or maize based product, and then we had our mafu, or vegetables, and lots of beans. Every once in a while, there was a chicken or eggs or goat. And when you had those meat items, you had maybe a piece or two pieces. And man, everyone that lives in the villages around me there was just ripped. Like, they all looked like they could be Olympic swimmers because they were very active, and they had this great, healthy, organic, plant-based diet. And so, it was a really cool glimpse of kind of that middle zone between hunter-gatherer into early agriculture before we get to this industrial agriculture and what it can make your body look like. So really cool there. I did want to go back to something that we didn't talk about as far as animal agriculture. And so we talked about the land use, we've talked about health and humans, but we missed a big piece on water use and how animal agriculture impacts the amount of water that we use. If you could dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, water is one that's very close to me. I'm a river runner. I spend as much time as possible in the water as possible. And yeah, particularly in the American West, right? So we see 51% of all the Colorado's river water that's consumed goes into animal agriculture. 51%. I mean, it's just like, you look at any sort of media around the Colorado River system and basin, it's all this talk about Phoenix and Las Vegas and Los Angeles are taking all the water. Oh, we got to cut back on water in our lawns. Absolutely, get rid of lawns entirely. There's no reason to have a European lawn in the American West. Like, there's no place for it. But when we look at the largest consumer is animal agriculture. About 55% of all water consumed in the United States is for animal agriculture, and again, about 5% for all domestic use. That's household and industry use is 5%. Fracking gets a lot of attention, which it should get a bunch of attention for its use in water. Again, it's not even 8% of the water consumed. So yeah, water consumption is a major one, and that's because we have to look at the water footprint. We're irrigating land, mostly flood irrigating, or aerial irrigating with sprinklers and sprayers, which is incredibly inefficient, to grow alfalfa, an incredibly water-intensive crop, to then feed to non-human animals for them to eat over the course of the next 3 to 4 years, to then slaughter. So to end up with this tiny amount of animal food versus the original inputs. And so it's massive. It's about 2,500 gallons of water produce a pound of meat. It's just astronomical. In Arizona, for example, about 70% of all water consumed in the state is for animal agriculture. And there was a bunch of attention recently about the Imperial Valley and the Yuma area growing alfalfa, and how these farms were growing alfalfa and exporting about 100. Now I'm trying to remember, 100 billion gallons. And it's, I'm not going to remember the number correctly.
100 billion gallons.
Yeah. It was an astronomical amount. I'm not going to quote a number because I can't pull it off the top of my head. An astronomical amount of water to Saudi Arabia in the form of alfalfa. They were growing alfalfa to ship to Saudi Arabia to feed livestock there. And there was a big pushback about it. They're like, this is insane. And so they changed it in Arizona that those farms are no longer owned by Saudis, but they're still producing alfalfa in the United States. And the reason for that, the Saudis were producing alfalfa and shipping it to Saudi Arabia, is because it's illegal to grow alfalfa in Saudi Arabia because it's so water intensive. They said we are a desert country. There's no way we can do this. And yet we're still doing that here in the United States. Unfortunately, it was racism and xenophobia that pushed for these Saudi ownership to end. But we're still producing these European crops, these super water intensive crops in arid lands to feed a Eurasian livestock. Um, Water pollution is another major one. We have flash floods in the American West, and the E. coli levels go through the roof. And it's like, well, it's not because human beings are defecating into the water system, and it's like it's not because there's deer and elk, in astronomical numbers that are causing these E. coli explosions. It's because of livestock, and you go through any area that's not heavily protected, any water system. There's cows in the water. There's cows on the banks. They're degrading banks. They're eating all the vegetation. Again, I keep harping back to the fact that these are Eurasian livestock because I want people to understand too that this is a colonial food system that has been supplanted onto this continent. You have these animals that evolved in German forests. They do not belong in the American West. They're going to stay really close to water, and so you see the degradation of water quality beyond just consumption. And then we end up with things like dead zones. So you have these massive areas in the Gulf of Mexico that are completely devoid of life because there's so much nutrient runoff through the Mississippi River Delta and the whole water system. And the primary driver for those nitrogen pollution is coming from animal agriculture, both from the waste coming off of feedlots, but also from the excess nitrogen from chemical fertilizers.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible how I think so much of that, like when you look at the ocean, right? You just don't see it, and you don't see all of that water that a cow is drinking. Back to your Las Vegas example, you do see the Bellagio, right? And you're like, oh, well, look at all that water. Oh my God. But so a lot of it is just kind of hidden around us. I would love to continue on this path. We didn't even touch on like rainforest. Oh wait, Sam's going to have a question, but we didn't have a discussion about like rainforest being cut down to try to replicate this model that we've created here and South America. But yeah, it just is this piece of yarn that you just keep pulling and pulling and pulling, and it goes into everything.
It
Sam,
really does.
go for it.
Yeah, I did. Before we move on to your current nonprofit work and projects, I did want to ask for folks listening that might be a little like me, where I'm a single mom, I work a lot, and meat has that convenience factor to it. What's one small change that people can make or a step that people can take to move away from meat or to improve the environment around them, through the food system?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest thing is beans, not beef. Yeah, anytime you're going to have beef, replace it with beans, and that can be canned beans. You can get an organic can of chickpeas for 99 cents from Whole Foods. I mean, or maybe not Whole Foods. I think they're $1.99 at Whole Foods, but you can get organic, pre-cooked canned beans that are healthy and amazing, really affordable. Pound for pound, they're cheaper than beef. They're more convenient. They don't have all the saturated fat. They have just as much protein, if not more protein. So I would say, yeah, beans, not beef would be probably the biggest bang for your buck that you can have. The other one would be dairy. Replacing animal milks with plant-based milks is also really a cost-effective, huge impacts to the planet. The interesting one is that the carbon footprint of sheep, of lambs, is actually higher than beef. We just consume a lot more beef. But so it's like if you're going to look at like the hierarchy of animal foods that we shouldn't be eating, lamb would be at the top. There was actually an interesting study on this that showed that from out of the UK that it was smaller carbon footprint to import all of your plant-based foods from South America by air than it was to raise sheep in your backyard and consume them.
Wow.
Because the carbon footprint of sheep is just so high. But so no sheep, definitely no cows, and then it goes down the list. The smaller the animals are, the smaller the carbon footprint is. But really, yeah, just wherever possible, switching out animal-based foods for plant-based foods. And then the convenience, there's a really cool website called Plant Based on a Budget that shows it's built by folks who just like yourself, Sam, who want to say, hey, how do we feed our families for as affordably and as efficiently and as easily as possible? And that's a great resource. We cover them in both What the Health and They're Trying to Kill Us on. Yeah, how do you do this? How do you eat healthfully for a family and for the planet?
Wonderful. That's so helpful. And we'll be sure to link to those with our podcast. Okay, Mark, I will let you shift the tides and go in another direction.
Yeah. Well, and then also on, so if you go onto the Cowspiracy website and then you click on the meal planner, that takes you to the What the Health website, correct?
Yeah, well, so it takes you to a meal planner. We worked with this company called Lighter, and they team you up with a dietitian, and you go through a guide and you figure out exactly how do you just switch to a more health-based diet, a more sustainable-based diet with your means, and that's kind of more of a premium service. The Plant Based on a Budget is a free program, and we have a ton of free options out there as well to switch to a plant-based diet. The meal planner is you have more of the hand holding to make it as easy as possible for you.
Okay. Well, here's a quick one for everyone. You talked about chickpeas. I on dinner a couple of nights ago, our protein was chickpeas. Air frying chickpeas is the most delicious, crunchy, yummy protein that either you can have it as a snack or as your part of your meal. So highly recommend
Yeah,
that.
about 80% of my diet right now is chickpeas. You can do everything with it. You can make hummus with it. You can make burgers with it. I do like a tuna mash with it. And yeah, chickpeas are awesome. And they're super high in calcium, super high in protein. They're like incredibly low in fat. They're just an awesome food. But pinto beans, really kind of whatever your bean is. And you look at most of the world eats a legume and a grain, right? It's usually rice, or it's rice and lentils, rice and soy. Or yeah, in the Americas, it's a bean and corn. And I think if we just start looking at what does most of the world eat, they don't eat meat 3 times a day. They eat meat once a week. And yes, as someone who's lived in Africa too, in sub-Saharan Africa, you start to see, you go, oh, right, meat is not a common thing. It is a luxury item. And it's a luxury because it's incredibly expensive. It's energy expensive, financially expensive, and resource expensive.
Yep. Yep, for sure. I'd love to keep talking about all of this and diving into
Yeah.
recipes as well. I'm
Well, so for anybody who wants to dive in deep, definitely check out Cowspiracy. It's available on Netflix. It's available on a bunch of other platforms as well. That goes into the full depth into like the rainforest, for example. There's What the Health that goes into the health impacts. They're Trying to Kill Us, which is much more focused on the social justice impacts of an animal-based diet and food as a weapon. We did a film called The End of Medicine, which looked at the use of antibiotics and zoonotic diseases coming out of animal agriculture, which we actually started working on before COVID hit. And was supposed to be like a warning that, hey, a global pandemic was coming. It's going to come out of animal agriculture. We did a film called Slay, which is about the use of animals in fashion. A film called Milk, which is about the dairy industry in Aotearoa, New Zealand. A whole bunch of other projects. So if you're interested in checking out any of this and going really deep on the subject, you can go to my website, which is firstsparkmedia.net, and there's links to pretty much all of my films.
awesome. And now you're going analog. So in Sedona, Arizona, you have you're working on the Red Rock Natural History Museum.
Yeah.
Tell us about that and why, as a successful documentary filmmaker, you decided, no, I'm going to open a museum up.
Yeah, it seems like a totally random shift. But the reality is that as we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, it's getting harder and harder to distribute documentaries, especially impactful documentaries. And so with that struggle and getting distribution, I work on a film for 5 years and then, very few people see it because it doesn't end up on a major platform. It built up a lot of frustration. I thought, okay, well, how do you reach people as effectively as possible? For me as an activist, it's always been about we have a limited number of resources in this movement, whether that's the environmental movement, the animal rights movement, the human justice movement. There's only so much money. There's only so much resources, so much time. How do we have the biggest impact possible? And because films are very energy intensive and they take a lot of time, I started to shift. And I have a background as an artist. As a paleo artist, I have a company called TRX Dinosaurs where I produce dinosaurs for museums. And so I have this love of the natural world. And I live in Sedona, Arizona, which has 4 million visitors every single year. We have 180 million years of exposed geology right there. You look out your window and you can see the Earth's history right in front of you. And so there is this lack, though. People come to this beautiful place and they don't get any sort of education. There's not great signage. There's not any sort of educational center about the amazing natural history here. So I thought, well, that's a missed opportunity. People are interested. Let's teach them. And so the museum, the Red Rock Naturalist Museum, is different from a lot of naturalist museums in that we have a very clear focus, which is inspiring wonder in the natural world and action to protect the present. Because natural history isn't just what happened 66 million years ago when the dinosaurs went extinct. It's also 100 years ago when wolves were extirpated from Arizona. It's, 100 years ago when there used to be jaguar widely, when there used to be Mexican grizzlies, when there used to be massive pronghorn populations, when there used to be parrots. When I tell people in Sedona that there used to be parrots here, a macaw parrot called the thick-billed parrot, they go, really? And then there used to be jaguar. Really? Like jaguars, South Americans. Like, no, jaguar belong all across the southern half of the United States. I mean, all the way to Louisiana, there was documentation of jaguar. So they potentially were even into Florida. But they've all, disappeared. And surprise, surprise, why did they disappear? Well, it's the livestock industry saw them as a threat to their industry. And so they exterminated them. They paid and they used policy. And we see that continuing today. So the museum is kind of, we're still in the process. We hopefully will be opening doors early next year. But it'll be 1/3 geology, 1/3 paleontology, and 1/3 ecology. So again, if people are already interested in the natural world, whether that's a love of dinosaurs, whether that's an interest in geology, whether that is interested in modern ecology, we utilize that as a starting point to say, okay, you love dinosaurs. Well, here's an opportunity to talk about extinction. Let's talk about the current mass extinction we're facing. And then it's also about scientific literacy. I like to think of myself as a science communicator because everything that my films have is science-backed and peer-reviewed. And so it's an opportunity to talk about climate change. Sadly, half of Americans don't believe in anthropogenic climate change. So we can opportunity to talk about that. And I was talking to someone who is a paleoclimatologist, studies paleoclimates. And, and she was asked, why is it, how do you respond to climate deniers? And she said, well, anytime someone says that, the climate change isn't human caused. I say, well, do you believe in the ice age? And I go, well, yeah. She goes, so climate change at some point, right? You believe in that. So why do you believe in that? Like someone told you, and it was a climate scientist who told you. So when a climate scientist tells you that the climate is changing because of our human impacts, believe them now, because you believe them when they told you it changed when the end of the ice age, that you believe them when it came to the end of Cretaceous. Understand that this science all comes from the same place. It's an opportunity to talk about evolution. It's an opportunity to talk about Earth history. 43% of Americans don't believe that the Earth is older than 10,000 years. So it's another opportunity to inform and educate. And for me, I really see the importance of cultural change. I bow to all of you who work in policy, who bang against that wall of legislation, that just unbelievable frustration of trying to push back against industry and government influence industry influence government. And for me, like my focus is on education and trying to inform so that an informed population can then make informed decisions and can have a better idea of the world that they live in. So the Red Rock Naturalist Museum is very much that. It's trying to inspire people to come here, be educated, and leave inspired to want to fight and work for the existing world that we live in and return some sort of semblance of balance to our ecosystems.
And so it's currently under development.
Yeah.
I know we talked a little bit recently about like the flow of it and how you could start at either end. If you could dive into that a little bit, I thought that was a really cool concept.
Yeah, thanks. So the idea, and this is pulling from my background as a storyteller, my background as an artist, is the museum will, in theory, we'll see how it works out. You'll be able to start at the beginning of time, or you'll be able to start at the present time and work in either direction. So you can start at the beginning of time, the beginning of the Earth, and you walk through the geologic history, which then leads you into paleontology, and so you get to see, the life develop as well. And the back of the museum is dinosaurs, which is what draws most people to naturalist museums. Dinosaurs are the golden children. And then you work forward. And so you come in through the end of the Cretaceous and you come into the more modern age of mammals, and you get to see mammoths and saber-toothed cats. I mean, just 10,000 years ago, right here in Sedona, we used to have 2 species of saber-toothed cat, 2 species of elephant, almost a 3rd species of an elephant-like animal, camels, horses, giant bears, giant wolves. I mean, all these incredible animals just 10,000 years ago who were living alongside, indigenous humans as well. And then you get to come into the modern age. Or you can start in present time and you see the modern ecology of Sedona, all the amazing animals that live here, or just the greater Southwest. But you go around the corner and there's a sign that says who's missing. And you see just 100 years ago, all the animals that are missing that we don't realize because of the shifting baseline syndrome, because we just accept, this is the way it's always been. Then you go back another 10,000 years and you see that, there was a mass extinction about 10, 11,000 years ago, and places seem very lost via mammoths and all these other incredible animals. And then you can go the other direction. So it gives an opportunity for people to kind of choose their own adventure and start where they're most interested, because that's what I find with storytelling and activism is that you have to start from a place that people are already interested in. So if you go to somebody who does not care about the environment at all and start talking to them about environmental impacts of anything, they're going to flavor. Yeah, they're not interested.
Thanks.
And vice versa, if you go to them and start talking to them about health and they're not interested in health, they're not going to be interested. So for me, it's always trying to figure out what's the place that people are already interested in and using that as the in. And so it's the same idea with the museum. And it's not like it's going to be a super preachy place. It's, I've come off pretty heavy on my frustrations with the animal agriculture industry. The museum is much softer, and it really is just about inspiring change. And whatever that change might be, hey, maybe that is switching to a plant-based diet. Maybe that is just recycling. Maybe that's just being aware of the fact of the impacts that we're having on this planet. But again, it's really just about inspiring people, informing and inspiring action to protect the modern world. And our slogan is understanding the past to protect the present.
Awesome. And so I imagine, you have the website, redrocknaturalhistorymuseum.org. And I imagine as things progress and you get closer to the opening date, that the website will be letting people know when to be the 4 millionth and one person to Sedona for the year. I know that I will certainly make my way down there when the museum opens. But Sam and I both thank you so much for coming on today. Both you've inspired me in your ability to bring storytelling and bring creativity to a useful place for people to make change in their own lives. So thank you again for coming on the Wildlife Wire.
Yeah, thank you, Keegan. I appreciate you. I mean, your ability to even retain all of these tiny numbers and data and facts is just, I am so impressed. And I've been so impressed by your work. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you both. I really do. I really, really do appreciate the work you both do. Protecting carnivores in particular is an issue very close to my heart, and I think is an incredibly important keystone issue to protect our environments. And so, truly from my heart, thank you for all the work that you're doing.
This has been an episode of the Wildlife Wire with me, Mark Searles, and my co-host, Samantha Miller. Thank you for listening.